My dear friends, it is a strange thing, is it not, that we so often measure life by its comforts rather than its lessons. We imagine that peace is the absence of trouble, that joy is the presence of ease, and that faith is the assurance of instant relief. Yet, if we examine the pages of history and the heart of Scripture, we will find a different story altogether. The great paradox of Christian faith is that trials, rather than destroying us, become the very chisel by which God shapes us. If you have ever watched a sculptor at work, you will know that he does not stroke the marble with gentle hands, but strikes it with force, removing what is unnecessary to reveal something beautiful. So too does God in His wisdom shape us through trials, not to break us, but to refine us. Many of us, when confronted with difficulty, ask, why has God allowed this? But perhaps a better question is, what is God doing through this? A man drowning in the sea does not benefit from debating how the waves arrived, but must instead fix his eyes on the lifeboat sent to save him. Likewise, faith is not the rejection of hardship, but the refusal to let hardship define us apart from God's purpose. We must remember this. Our suffering is neither final nor wasted. If we trust Him, He will take the very weight that burdens us and turn it into wings that lift us. He has done it before. When Joseph was thrown into prison, when the Israelites stood before the Red Sea, when Peter sat in a cell awaiting his fate, the darkness that seemed final was merely the prelude to deliverance. Faith, then, is not the denial of suffering, but the certainty that suffering does not have the final word. We walk through the valley not because we are abandoned, but because we are being led to higher ground. The hand of God does not always remove the storm, but it teaches us how to navigate it, and when the time is right, He speaks, and the winds obey. So I urge you, do not fear the trial you are facing. Do not mistake silence for absence, nor delay for denial. The same God who turned the grave into victory, who turned sorrow into joy, and who turned weakness into strength, is still at work today. And He will turn your situation around, if only you hold fast to faith. Suffering, though unpleasant and often bewildering, is not without meaning. The human instinct is to flee from pain, to seek shelter from the storm, and to question why difficulties arise in the first place. But to the Christian, suffering is not an accident, nor is it a sign of divine neglect. Rather, it is one of the tools by which God shapes the soul, refining it like gold in the furnace. It is often through the weight of our trials that we are strengthened, through the depth of our sorrow that we come to appreciate joy, and through the darkness of suffering that we learn to long for the light. Consider the natural world. A tree that grows in calm, undisturbed conditions with no wind to challenge it may appear strong, but the moment a storm comes it is easily uprooted. Yet a tree that has faced the fury of the wind, that has bent and swayed under the pressure of the elements, will develop deeper roots and a firmer foundation. God in His wisdom allows trials not to break us, but to establish us in a faith that can withstand every tempest. There is, of course, a common misconception that suffering is purely punitive, a divine retribution for sin or a sign of God's displeasure. This view is not only unhelpful, but untrue. While suffering can sometimes result from our own poor choices, there are many times when even the righteous endure great hardship. Job, a man described as blameless and upright, suffered immense loss, not as a punishment, but as a test of faith and an eventual demonstration of God's restoration. The apostles who walked closely with Christ faced persecution, imprisonment, and even death, not because they were abandoned, but because they were entrusted with a faith that could endure suffering. One must ask, then, what is the purpose of such trials? Why would a loving God permit suffering if he has the power to prevent it? The answer, though difficult to grasp, lies in the understanding that suffering in the hands of God becomes an instrument of transformation. It is through hardship that we are purified, much like gold refined by fire. A craftsman does not leave a precious metal in its raw, impure state, but subjects it to intense heat, burning away all that is unnecessary until only the purest form remains. So it is with our souls. God allows trials to burn away pride, selfishness, and the illusions of self-sufficiency, leading us to a greater reliance on Him. Moreover, suffering teaches us compassion. A person who has never known pain may sympathize with the struggles of others in a distant theoretical way, but one who has walked through the valley of hardship knows intimately what it means to weep, to struggle, and to hope against all odds. Such a person is equipped not only to endure, but to comfort others, offering the very encouragement that they once longed for. It is no accident that some of the most compassionate people in history, those who have given their lives to serving the broken, the sick, and the weary, are often those who have endured suffering themselves. Suffering also serves to detach us from the fleeting comforts of this world and to remind us of what is eternal. In prosperity, it is easy to believe that we are in control, that we are the masters of our own fate. But when hardship comes, when health fails, when financial security crumbles, when relationships falter, we are forced to confront the reality of our own limitations. This is not a cruelty but a mercy, for it redirects our gaze from the temporal to the eternal, from the fragile security of earthly things to the unshakable promises of God. C.S.Lewis once wrote, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Pain awakens us to our need for God in a way that comfort never can. In the grand narrative of Scripture, suffering is never the end of the story. Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery and imprisoned for years, but in the end he rose to power and was used by God to save many lives. The Israelites endured the oppression of Egypt, the wilderness and exile, but God's plan for them never wavered. Even Christ himself, the very Son of God, was not exempt from suffering. He was despised, rejected, and crucified. Yet, through his suffering came the greatest victory the world has ever known, the redemption of mankind. If even the Saviour of the world was perfected through suffering, how can we, as his followers, expect to be spared from it? Thus, when we face trials, we must resist the temptation to see them as meaningless burdens or as evidence that God has abandoned us. Rather, we must recognize them as opportunities for growth, as moments in which our faith is tested and strengthened. We must trust that, though we may not understand the purpose of our suffering in the present, God is weaving a greater story, one in which even our pain is not wasted. We must cling to the promise that suffering, though bitter, produces endurance, endurance character, and character hope. And hope does not disappoint. It is not the hope of wishful thinking or blind optimism, but the hope that rests in the unwavering faithfulness of God, the same God who walked with Joseph in prison, with Daniel in the lion's den, and with Paul in his shipwrecks, walks with us in our trials. The same God who raised Christ from the dead has promised to work all things together for the good of those who love him. If we believe this, then suffering ceases to be an enemy and becomes, instead, a teacher, a refining fire that, though painful, will ultimately lead us into the fullness of what God intends for us to be. So let us not despise our trials, nor seek to escape them prematurely. Instead, let us embrace them with the confidence that God, in his perfect wisdom, is using them to shape us, to strengthen us, and to draw us closer to himself. For, in the end, it is not the absence of suffering that defines the Christian life, but the presence of a faith that endures through it. And when the trial has passed, we will find ourselves not weaker, but stronger, not defeated, but victorious, and not abandoned, but held securely in the hands of a God who turns suffering into glory. Faith is often misunderstood. Many believe it to be a kind of blind optimism, a naive insistence that everything will turn out well, regardless of the circumstances. But true faith is not about ignoring reality. It is about seeing reality more clearly. It is about recognizing that, beyond what is immediately visible, there is a greater story unfolding, one in which every trial, every hardship, and every sorrow has meaning. Faith does not deny suffering, it reframes it. It does not always change our circumstances immediately, but it transforms the way we see them. Imagine a man lost in a dense fog. To him, the world seems to end just a few feet ahead. Every step forward is uncertain, every movement filled with hesitation. Yet, if he could rise above the fog, if he could see from a higher vantage point, he would realize that the path is still there, even if he cannot see it from where he stands. This is what faith does. It lifts our perspective beyond the immediate hardship and allows us to trust that there is more to the story than what we can presently perceive. Many people think faith is only necessary in moments of great crisis, but in truth, it is needed every day. It shapes how we view success and failure, joy and sorrow, gain and loss. Without faith, we see only what is temporary. When trouble comes, we assume that all is lost. When we suffer, we believe that suffering is the end of the story. But faith reminds us that God's work is not always visible in the moment. What appears to be defeat may, in fact, be preparation for victory. What seems like a delay may be the precise timing of divine purpose. Consider the story of the disciples caught in the storm. They had seen Jesus perform miracles. They had watched him heal the sick, feed the hungry, and calm the troubled. And yet, when the storm came, fear overtook them. They saw only the waves, only the wind, only the water rising around them. They forgot, in that moment, that the very Son of God was in the boat with them. This is the challenge of faith. It is easy to trust when the sea is calm, but the real test comes when the storm rages. It is easy to trust when the storm rages, and yet Jesus did not abandon them to their fear. He stood, spoke, and the storm obeyed. Faith changes how we respond to suffering because it reminds us that we are not alone. It is not the mere belief that things will improve. It is the certainty that even in the worst of times, God is with us. The world tells us that security is found in wealth, health, and personal achievement. But faith tells us that our security is found in something far greater. A person without faith sees suffering as a meaningless interruption to life. A person with faith sees it as a season through which God is still at work. There is great power in perspective. Two people can go through the same difficulty and emerge with entirely different conclusions. One will say, "This hardship has ruined me." The other will say, This hardship has shaped me. The difference between these two is not the severity of their suffering, but the lens through which they view it. Faith is that lens. It allows us to look at pain and see purpose. It allows us to endure trials without despair. It allows us to move forward even when the path is unclear, because we trust the one who guides us. Faith does not make suffering disappear, but it does make it bearable. Imagine a traveler carrying a heavy load. If he believes that his burden is meaningless, every step is misery. But if he knows that his burden has a purpose, that it is carrying something of great worth, something essential, then the weight does not feel the same. The load is just as heavy, but his perspective has changed. He no longer resents it. He carries it willingly because he knows it is leading him somewhere worthwhile. This is what faith does in our lives. It does not always remove the burden, but it gives us the strength to carry it. The greatest proof of faith's power is found in the lives of those who have endured suffering with unshaken trust in God. History is filled with men and women who face trials yet refuse to be broken by them. They understood something the world could not grasp, that suffering does not have the final word. The Apostle Paul, imprisoned and beaten for his faith, wrote of joy in suffering. Job, who lost everything, still declared, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." These were not people who lived easy lives. They were not spared from pain, yet they saw beyond it. Faith, then, is not an escape from suffering, nor is it wishful thinking. It is the deep conviction that God is at work even in the darkest moments. It is the trust that He is using all things, both joys and sorrows, for a purpose beyond what we can presently see. It is the confidence that even when everything around us seems to be falling apart, we are still held in the hands of one who never fails. There will be times when faith seems difficult, when prayers go unanswered, when trials persist longer than expected, when the weight of suffering feels unbearable. It is in these moments that faith is most crucial. It is easy to trust God when everything is going well, but true faith is forged in the fire of difficulty. It is in suffering that we learn to lean on Him fully, to surrender our own understanding, and to trust that He knows what we do not. Faith is not passive. It does not mean sitting idly and waiting for circumstances to change. It means moving forward, even when the way is unclear. It means choosing to trust, even when doubt whispers otherwise. It means holding on to God's promises, even when everything around us suggests we should let go. In the end, faith transforms suffering, not by removing it, but by giving it meaning. It allows us to see beyond our present pain and to trust that, in time, we will understand what we cannot see now. It reminds us that God is never absent, that He is always at work, and that no hardship is wasted in His hands. With faith, we do not merely endure suffering, we walk through it with the certainty that on the other side we will see God's purpose fulfilled. There is a curious tension in human nature, an impulse to trust only what can be seen and measured, to believe only in what is immediately evident. We live in a world that values certainty, where knowledge is equated with proof, and where the unseen is often dismissed as unreal. Yet, if we look closely, we will see that much of what truly shapes our lives operates beyond our immediate perception. The roots of a tree grow beneath the soil long before its branches stretch toward the sky. The foundation of a house is laid before a single wall is built. The most essential processes in nature, growth, healing, transformation, often happen in secret, out of sight. So it is with the work of God. One of the greatest challenges of faith is trusting that God is working even when there is no visible evidence. We long for instant results, for prayers answered in the way and time we expect, for circumstances to change immediately. And yet, more often than not, God's work is slow, deliberate, unfolding in ways we cannot see or comprehend. It is in these seasons when progress is invisible, when prayers seem unheard, when trials persist, that our faith is tested. Will we trust that God is at work even when we do not see His hand? In the Scriptures we find countless examples of God working behind the scenes, often long before His people recognize what He is doing. Consider Joseph, betrayed by his own brothers and sold into slavery. For years he endured hardship, imprisonment, and injustice. From the outside, his situation appeared hopeless, but beneath the surface, God was orchestrating events in a way that would one day place Joseph in a position of power, not only to save himself, but to rescue an entire nation from famine. At any point during those years of suffering, Joseph could have concluded that God had abandoned him. And yet, in hindsight, we see that God had been working all along, through every setback, every hardship, every delay, to accomplish something far greater than Joseph could have imagined. There is a lesson here for us. Just because we cannot see immediate change does not mean that nothing is happening. The seed that is buried beneath the soil does not sprout the moment it is planted. For a time it remains hidden, unseen, seemingly lifeless. But beneath the surface a transformation is taking place. Roots are spreading, strength is forming, and at the appointed time the seed breaks through the ground, revealing what had been growing all along. Our prayers, our faith, our obedience, they are like seeds planted in the soil of God's timing. And though we may not see immediate results, we must trust that something is happening beneath the surface. The danger is that in our impatience we assume that silence means inactivity. When God does not act according to our timeline, we grow anxious, doubtful, even resentful. We question His faithfulness, forgetting that His ways are higher than ours. But history teaches us that God is never idle. He is always moving, always arranging, always preparing, even when we do not perceive it. And often, what seems like delay is, in fact, divine preparation. Think of Moses, who spent 40 years in the wilderness before he was called to lead Israel out of Egypt. From a human perspective, those years may have seemed like wasted time. But in reality, they were a season of preparation, a necessary period in which Moses was shaped for the task ahead. Had he been called too soon, he would not have been ready. God was not absent during those years. He was working, refining, equipping, and when the time was right, Moses was sent. The same pattern appears in the life of David. Anointed as king while still a young shepherd, he did not immediately ascend to the throne. Instead, he endured years of waiting, fleeing from Saul, facing hardship and uncertainty. Again, it would have been easy for David to assume that God's promise had failed, but in reality, every trial, every delay was part of God's process, shaping him into the leader he was meant to be. When the moment arrived, he was ready, not because he had forced his way to the throne, but because he had allowed God to work in the unseen. If this is true in Scripture, then it is true in our lives as well. When we face difficulties, it is natural to want immediate relief. We long for a visible sign that God is intervening, but often His greatest work is happening beneath the surface, where we cannot yet see it. The challenge is to trust that even in silence, even in waiting, God is moving. There is great danger in relying only on what is seen. If we judge God's faithfulness by our immediate circumstances, we will be easily shaken. If we believe that He is only at work when we see clear evidence, then our faith will waver in the moments of uncertainty. But if we understand that God's ways are often hidden, if we trust that He is always working even when we do not perceive it, then we will stand firm even in the darkest times. Consider the cross. To those who stood at Calvary, it appeared to be the ultimate defeat. Jesus, the promised Messiah, crucified like a common criminal. To the disciples, to the onlookers, to the world, it seemed as though all hope had been lost, and yet in that very moment, God was working the greatest victory in history. What seemed like the end was in fact the beginning. 3 days later, the truth was revealed. The unseen work of God had triumphed. This is the pattern of God's working. What appears to be hopeless is often the prelude to something greater. What seems like delay is often divine preparation. What looks like defeat is often the setting for redemption. If we hold on to this truth, we will not be easily discouraged. Instead, we will learn to wait with confidence, to trust with certainty, and to believe that even when we do not see, God is still moving. So we must not give in to despair when answers seem slow in coming. We must not assume that God is silent simply because we cannot hear Him in the way we expect. We must resist the temptation to measure God's faithfulness by our own timeline. Instead, we must hold fast to the truth that He is always at work, always moving, always bringing about His purpose in ways that we may not yet understand. There will come a day when the unseen becomes visible, when what was hidden is revealed. In that moment, we will look back and realize that God was working all along, turning every hardship, every delay, every unanswered prayer into something far greater than we could have imagined. And when that day comes, we will see with perfect clarity what we now must trust in faith, that God was never absent, never idle, but always working for our good. Hope is one of the most powerful forces in the human heart, yet it is also one of the most fragile. It can be easily lost in the face of prolonged suffering, unanswered prayers, and relentless trials. When hardship drags on, when solutions seem distant, when pain lingers far beyond what we imagined, hope can feel like a cruel illusion, something we reach for but cannot grasp. Yet, hope is not merely a fleeting feeling, it is a vital necessity for the soul. Without hope, despair takes root. Without hope, fear triumphs. But the foundation of true hope is not in circumstances, emotions, or human effort. It is in God Himself. And because He is unchanging, our hope, when anchored in Him, remains firm, even in the worst of times. It is easy to have hope when life is comfortable, when prayers are answered quickly, when the future looks bright. But the real test of hope comes when everything seems to be falling apart. In those moments we are faced with a choice. Do we allow despair to overtake us, or do we hold on, trusting that God will turn things around? The world teaches us to hope in temporary things, wealth, success, human relationships, personal achievements. But these things, no matter how good, are uncertain. They can fail us, they can disappear, and if our hope is placed in them, we are left with nothing when they crumble. True hope, the kind that endures even in suffering, must be built on something greater than the shifting sands of this world. It must be built on the unshakable character of God. One of the most striking things about Scripture is how often hope is presented not as a mere wish for things to improve, but as a certainty rooted in God's faithfulness. In Romans, Paul writes that hope does not put us to shame, because it is grounded in the love of God. The psalmist declares, "Why are you downcast, O my soul? Put your hope in God." Over and over we are reminded that hope is not about ignoring reality, nor is it about pretending that suffering does not exist. Rather, it is about seeing beyond our current pain, believing that God is at work even when we cannot see it, and trusting that He will bring about redemption in His perfect timing. Consider the story of Job. Here was a man who lost everything: his wealth, his health, his family. His suffering was deep, prolonged, and seemingly unjust. He had every reason to despair, and yet, even in his agony, he uttered these words, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." Job's hope was not in his own ability to fix his situation. It was not in his friends, nor in any human comfort. It was in God alone. And in the end, though he did not understand the reason for his suffering, God restored him. His story reminds us that even when we cannot see the full picture, even when life seems unbearably cruel, hope in God is never in vain. Hope is not passive. It is not simply sitting back and waiting for things to change. Hope moves us forward, even when we do not yet see the destination. It gives us the strength to endure, the courage to keep going, the resilience to rise even after we have fallen. It does not deny hardship, but it refuses to be defeated by it. A person without hope gives up when trials come. A person with hope continues to press on, believing that the story is not yet over. Many times the darkest moments come just before the breakthrough. A seed must first break open underground before it begins to grow. The night is always coldest before the dawn, and so it is in our lives. Sometimes, just when we feel as though we cannot endure another moment, the change we long for is just ahead. But hope requires patience. It requires trust in God's timing, even when His timing does not align with ours. If we give up too soon, if we let go of hope just before the breakthrough, we may miss the very thing God was preparing for us. The cross is the greatest example of this truth. To the disciples, to the followers of Jesus, to all who had placed their trust in Him, His death must have seemed like the end of all hope. The one they believed was the Messiah had been crucified. The dream they had followed had been buried in a tomb. For 3 days they lived in what must have felt like complete devastation. But on the 3rd day, hope rose from the grave. What had seemed like the greatest defeat was, in fact, the greatest victory. If they had given up in that moment of darkness, they would not have seen the glory of the resurrection. This is why we must hold on, even when hope seems distant. We may not always understand why suffering happens. We may not see the full picture until much later, but we can trust that God is always working, always redeeming, always bringing something beautiful out of what seems broken. What feels like the end may in fact be the beginning of something greater than we can imagine. Hope is not based on perfect circumstances. It is not about avoiding trials, but about knowing that trials do not have the final word. It is about seeing beyond the present struggle and believing in the faithfulness of God. It is about trusting that He will turn things around, not always in the way we expect, but always in the way that is best. We must learn to cultivate this kind of hope, not a shallow optimism that depends on everything going well, but a deep-rooted confidence that no matter what happens, God is still in control. This kind of hope changes the way we face difficulties. It allows us to endure suffering without being crushed by it. It gives us the strength to keep moving forward, even when we do not see the outcome. It reminds us that every trial has an expiration date, but God's promises do not. There will be moments when hope seems impossible, when everything in us wants to give up. In those times, we must remember that our hope is not in ourselves, nor in our circumstances, but in the one who has never failed. He who parted the Red Sea, who fed the multitudes, who raised the dead, is the same God who is working in our lives today. He is not limited by time, by human reasoning, or by impossible odds. So we must hold on. Even when it is difficult, even when the waiting is long, even when the answers do not come as quickly as we would like, hold on. The story is not over. The same God who has been faithful throughout history will be faithful to us. He will turn the situation around. He will redeem what was lost. He will make a way where there seems to be none. And when we finally see the full picture, we will understand that every moment of waiting, every season of struggle, was not in vain. It was all leading to something greater than we could have ever imagined.